Okay, we're going to get started, and folks will join as they can. I'm Nina Axelson. I'm the president of Grid Catalyst. We're a Minnesota-based energy accelerator. If you haven't interacted with Grid Catalyst before, we're thrilled that this is the first time you've had a chance to come and interact with our programming. We were started in 2021 with a fairly simple purpose for us, but a complex purpose in the ecosystem, which is trying to bridge the gap between really exciting technology that usually makes it all the way to the lab and then runs into all sorts of challenges trying to get through the what we call the commercialization valley of death, which is proving that your technology works in real world applications to make sure that customers feel comfortable adopting that technology. And that also is kind of at the heart of today's conversation. So it's really apropos and why this study was so compelling to us when we were given the opportunity. Just a little bit more background on that before I hand things over to Gabe Chan. So we are really lucky to be part of the IN2 Innovation Incubator Channel Partnership. This is a partnership between the National Lab of the Rockies and Wells Fargo. And we've been members of that for several years now. And we participated in something they hosted called Camp Clean Tech in 2024. And we're given the opportunity to really dial in with startups of helping them think about how to be pilot ready and recognizing that the work to bridge the gap between startups and utilities or startups and market adopters, whoever they may be, is not just in the responsibility of one or the other, right? We all have to kind of look at this and say, what's the role that we play to bridge this and to get across that commercialization valley of death. So we were doing work with startups to help them understand, to think about their technological readiness level, their market readiness level, and their adoption readiness level, which are all measuring sticks used by the Department of Energy and are really useful. If you haven't, I'll drop a link in the chat to those to take a look at. They're also referenced in the study. And this might be a good time, Becky, if you could drop a link to the study in the chat in case someone came to the Zoom but hasn't taken a look at the study yet. So we approached our friends at the University of Minnesota and the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and Gabe Chan and Matt Grimley, who we already knew as experts in thinking about utility innovation and thinking about what are the dials that we turn to make things work? How do we get people to the table differently? How do we de-risk things? How do we bring the right collaborations together, the right policies together, et cetera? And so the result is this study that we've worked on for over the last year. And uh, I'm just going to just emphasize that we would not have been able to do this if it were not for the backing of IN2 and if it weren't for the expertise of Gabe and Matt. I don't even think we would have attempted it without Gabe and Matt. So just really thrilled that they were able to be in this collaboration with us and do so much leadership on the research side. And that's why Gabe will be presenting on the results of the study today. So we'll spend some time with that. We'll do a little bit of Q&A, and then we will pivot over to our expert panel. You can see on your screens right now. And you'll have a chance to really hear from the people who have their hands in the work and are trying to make innovation happen, not just in Minnesota, but across the country. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gabe.
Great. Thanks so much, Nina. And, like you shared, this was a fantastic collaboration from our perspective as well. We really enjoyed this opportunity to dig into this question of how to accelerate utility innovation and startup collaboration. So I'm going to go over our report in about 15 minutes or so, giving a high-level overview of our findings and recommendations. Before doing so, I wanted to share a little bit about our author team. As Nina mentioned, this is a partnership study between the Humphrey School and Grid Catalyst. Matt Grimley, my colleague here at the Humphrey School, staff researcher, led a lot of our research design and implementation. Myself, I am on the faculty here at the Humphrey School. And then you've heard from Nina and Becky, who is also with Grid Catalyst. Great, so let's just jump right into it. Our report is all about the need for utility startup collaboration. I think as everyone here knows, there are so many things that are changing in the energy system. We have distributed energy resources, or DERs, electrification, new emerging technology, low carbon technology like long duration storage and geothermal energy. And we have all this new software, coming to digitize and integrate artificial intelligence into utility practices. And then also this rapid increase in demand coming from the same AI data centers that are really challenging grid planners in new and, frankly, like pretty surprising ways, just looking just a few years ago. And this all comes in a context where utilities have what we have identified as structural limitations on how they think about innovation. And this comes from a few different places. One is regulation. Utilities are one of the most regulated sectors in the economy. And so how they approach new technologies is going to have to go through these processes. Risk aversion. When the job is keeping the lights on, integrating new technology can introduce risk into that fundamental delivery of a universal basic service. And that risk aversion comes from a place of needing to require stability and reliability. But also legacy processes. Utilities have been around, many of them for 100 years or so, and those processes, have kept the grid working, but are not designed in many ways to integrate new technologies. So you have that on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have startups, which are agile organizations that have a lot of new, interesting ideas, but many of them aren't proven yet. That's why they're still startups. And how those two types of very different organizations come together was really the focus of our study. And we identify this collaboration, and Nina used the word ecosystem. We're going to come back to that word at the end here throughout the report, because this collaboration is happening in the context of a lot of organizations that are shaping the future of the electric sector. Okay, so why are utilities lagging innovation? I already started on this a little bit, but this figure, I think, is a really important starting point, which is that compared to all the other major sectors of the economy, utilities invest one of the smallest fractions of their revenue in research and development. By our estimates in the report, it's 0.2% of revenue. You can compare it to the other sectors shown in this bar chart here, and it's just really low. There's no really getting around that. Even when you factor in some of the joint utility efforts, like through the Electric Power Research Institute, it's still extremely low compared to other sectors on this metric of percent of revenue. And again, this is because this is a sector that's about reliability. It's a sector that has regulatory processes that provide a lot of strict scrutiny on what types of costs can be incurred. But it's also a kind of institutional and organizational cultural dimension here. Utilities have limited internal capacity and processes to evaluate emerging technologies. So as we think about this, one of the really helpful frameworks that we introduced in the report is this technology readiness level, or TRL scale. This is not TRL from like the late 90s MTV. This is a scheme developed by originally NASA to evaluate emerging technologies based on their technology risk. And so starting all the way on the left here at TRLs 1 through 4, these are early stage technologies that are being proven in the laboratory. Then as you move forward to TRLs 5 and 6, this is where you start to prototype technologies and maybe start piloting. At TRL 7 and 8, you're looking into manufacturing and supply chain, potentially licensing these technologies. TRL 9 is where you start to initially start commercial sales. And then TRL beyond that, you're in the market already. And so one of the key challenges is that the utilities we talk to typically are only looking at technologies at that TRL 8 or 9. So these are technologies that have already been significantly de-risked. They're way past the prototype scale, and they're already in early manufacturing or already have some other sales. A lot of utilities described not wanting to be at that bleeding edge. But startups are typically at that TRL 5 to 7. And they're looking for those opportunities to pilot their technology, sometimes for the first time. And so one of these key challenges is that there's just a mismatch. Nina used the word valley of death in introducing this. You can see here what the graph at the top is showing is the amount of involvement by different actors, the public sector, the private sector, different investors with different risk tolerances. And there are these different valleys of death where there are kind of it's too late for government, but too early for industry, or it's, you know, too early for a utility, but too late for a startup. These different kinds of valleys of death where you need to bridge over and move from pilot to manufacturing or from manufacturing into sales. Those are these really hard points where there needs to be connection and additional resources invested. What we saw was that a lot of utilities don't have experience at those earlier TRL levels. And so when it comes to trying to shape these partnerships for commercialization, there oftentimes is a lot of kind of education, a two-way education going on between startups and utilities about how does this technology work on the utility side, and then, you know, how do the utility decision-making processes work on the startup side. And so this kind of ongoing collaboration throughout these TRL levels, we saw is really important. It's those technology readiness levels. Okay, so let's jump into some of our findings. In our study, we conducted interviews with 17 utilities across the country, but with an oversampling of Minnesota utilities. And what we found was that really importantly, as I mentioned, very few utilities are working at those early TRL levels. But also, as we talked about how utilities are working with emerging technology, very few had origination processes that were formal. So when talking about, you know, for the utilities that have worked with startups, we asked, how did these relationships start? How did you start working with these startups? And really only one utility that we talked to described a formal kind of stage-gated process for evaluating pilots, startups, or demonstration technologies. Most describe these kind of ad hoc processes, like, you know, we met at a conference, or we, you know, happened to go to a pitch day and make this connection. That kind of formal process was quite rare. When we asked, how are you evaluating startups? How are you evaluating emerging technology? A lot of the evaluation that we heard from the utility side was based off of financial metrics or commercial availability. And so there wasn't like a clear kind of technology assessment piece to it. It was much more based on how that fits into the kind of traditional utility decision making around, you know, prudent and useful investments. And then when we asked, like, what would it take at your utility to integrate more emerging technology, a lot of what we heard in terms of barriers was a lack of staff time to actually go out and do that origination work, a lack of dedicated funding to go after emerging technology with more technology risk behind it, some cultural elements of not wanting to kind of be at that bleeding edge or take technology risk. And then for regulated utilities, a lack of regulatory clarity on whether or not this was something regulators expected of the utilities that they saw. Here on the right side is a quote from one of our utility interviewees, which basically said that it would be helpful to have a top-down goal or a specific person or group that was really charged with innovation, which across our interviewees was quite rare. So in addition to interviewing these utilities, we also conducted a survey that Grid Catalyst charged with startups, energy technology startups. We surveyed about 24 startups across the country, of which almost 3/4 had successfully engaged a utility in a pilot for their technology. One of the key questions was, you know, what made this work well? And as you can see on the figure on the right, it was having a strong business case, having innovative and useful technology, availability of funding, and then further down are these kinds of connections into the utility. A lot of times the barriers of what made it hard was finding the right person inside the utility to talk to, finding that decision maker inside the utility that could actually grapple with this emerging technology. And so I think that was one of the key things that we take into our recommendations was for a lot of startups, it's hard to find the front door at the utility to make that kind of business connection for commercialization and demonstration. Okay, so then one of the last things in our kind of data that we collected was thinking about these intermediaries. In 40% of the successful startup utility partnerships that we found from the startup side, where 40% were facilitated by intermediaries. And from our utility interviews, 2/3 of utilities recommended to startups that they work with third parties, in part to help find the right front door, to help refine their pitch, to make them more relevant to the utility needs. So we concluded that these intermediaries are providing really useful matchmaking, technology vetting services, risk mitigation, and regulatory navigation. So really helping to bridge within the ecosystem these connections. And so obviously Grid Catalyst is one of our local examples, but we also heard from a number of utilities who themselves have created their own kind of intermediaries to help shape that front door and make that easier for startups to understand. Okay, so let's turn to our recommendations. We've broken out our recommendations by audience. So first, for our recommendations for utilities, the first recommendation is to create more transparent origination and assessment frameworks. We think that in this world of technology or more risky technology, being clearer about how these technologies can be integrated into the business and how they will be assessed are really important. And then having that funding to back it up and the staff to back it up. These kind of risk assessment tools are used by a lot of other industries to assess emerging technology. And we think more broad adoption of these assessment and processes for innovation could be really helpful in the utility sector. Partly this can be done with partnerships with accelerators and other intermediaries, the national labs or universities that have a lot of experience assessing technology risk. And that can be really valuable. Another piece that we thought would be really useful for more utilities to adopt is to more clearly communicate their technology needs. We found through Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, based out in California, they do these annual reports where they get very specific on what their technology needs are. And they publish these detailed reports saying, this is what we need from emerging technology to meet our business needs. Having that out there really helped startups find them. And as you can see here from their 2024 report, they reported 630 responses to the utilities' call for solutions across their 67 problems that they identified. So I think this recommendation, utilities getting clearer on their processes and their needs. For regulators, we have a number of recommendations learning from a few states that have started to develop these different kinds of sandboxes or test beds or more formal pilot mechanisms. We recommend that there are clearer regulatory pathways that can enable technology pilots to get approved within 12 months. That quicker timeline is critical to meet the financial constraints of startups. Having this more clearly consolidated review of pilots with clearer criteria, having innovation perhaps more consolidated in specific dockets with clearer cost recovery mechanisms and accounting for innovation differently than traditional already proven technology is really important. So here's an example of Connecticut, which is really seen as a leader in this innovation sandbox testbed environment. This is how they structure in a very formal way at their utility regulatory authority, how they bring in new technology, evaluate it, and then give it a green light, go ahead to demonstrate, a yellow light, go back and refine, or red light, you're kicked out of the program. That kind of more rapid prototyping, failing fast, is a really important part of what regulators could help do in the ecosystem. And then we have recommendations for policymakers, startups, and intermediaries. For policymakers, we saw a number of interesting ideas from other states, like actually providing specific direction and funding for utilities to undertake innovation. Some states have something called a public benefit charge that allows for some amount of more stable funding towards energy innovation in the utilities. On the startup side, we found a number of opportunities for really like strengthening this part of the intermediary ecosystem, creating these testing environments, being clearer about their own risk and what they need to be able to de-risk in a pilot to be able to scale in the future. And then for the intermediaries, a lot of kind of ecosystem development and stewarding, like forums to connect utilities and startups with pitches and reverse pitches. technical advisory support, helping startups navigate the complex world of utilities, but also utilities to better understand the needs of startups in their environment. Okay, and last slide here. I want to come back to this idea of the ecosystem that Nina started us with. Throughout all of this, we recognize that the utility system is changing really fast, and that can, in some ways, create even more risk aversion because, we're trying to balance gigawatts of new load and not break everything. But at the same time, what an opportunity to start to integrate new technology. In some ways, like because the system is changing so fast, this could be a very ripe time to more closely look at our processes for innovation in this period of change, meeting the moment of incredible new demand with new technology that can more cost effectively meet this new demand with clean technology. And so, there are structural issues that I started with. There are cultural issues, both inside startups and utilities, and there are regulatory issues. But all of this seems solvable. And I think through the examples that we found within Minnesota and across other states, these do seem eminently solvable. But to do so, I think, what the biggest takeaway from our report is how do we coordinate across the ecosystem? So how do we think across technology levels? How do we think across different kinds of risk levels and funding levels to make sure that we have the right institutions in place that can help steward these technologies all the way from TRL, 1 through 5, all the way into large scale deployment. All right, so with that, I'll throw our pictures back up here. I think we have a little time for Q&A.
Thank you, Gabe. Even having been so close to this for the last year and change, it's amazing to see that so well described in such a short period of time. So thank you for that representation of the work and the why and the potential. A few things I just want to note as we move to the Q&A, or just at least highlight from what Gabe was talking about here. We came into this with a national perspective. We talked to national partners, national startups, and it's always this balancing act between what's going on at the federal level or even globally, we know impacts our work no matter how local you try to make it. And so this conversation today is intended to have a little bit of a foot in both places where there's so much we can learn as Minnesotans from what's going on nationally. We also have a lot to learn with some experts and people doing great things here, and that'll be part of our panel too. But really kind of the call to action from us will be, what next? What do we do with that information? So we'll maybe hear some of that from our panel as we go forward, but just wanted to note those things. So two questions out of the Q&A, and if folks have more, feel free to, a few more here maybe. So the question from Ryan Casey was curious what the R&D percentage is for suppliers of equipment to the electric utility industry. Gabe, I know that initial R&D stat came from your team. Do you have any idea, or do any of our panelists know?
I'm not sure. This data comes from the NSF business surveys, so that could be something we look into, but I don't know the answers to that question.
Yeah. Brian, that might have to be a good challenge for our next phase of work. All right. And then Peter Reese had a note in here. Just if there's anything, Gabe, you would note, or I can weigh into of like recognizing that TRL is just one way to measure progress. It's actually, sort of self-select anyway, so it's not a perfect system. We recognize that, and there's a lot of complexity and uphill components to that. But anything around like certification or other things and like readiness that you want to comment on?
Yeah, of course, TRL is imperfect. I think that in some ways, what's really important is that utilities themselves or the adopters of these technologies actually do their own risk assessment. TRL can be a useful proxy to communicate, I think, broadly, but I think what's really important is that the risk requirements of the utilities are clearly articulated and then applied on a case-by-case basis. And TRL is kind of like a backbone to how to think about this. But really what's important is that the individual technology risk is something that the utilities can get comfortable with.
Yeah, great. Next question is about intermediaries, and I'll give you the mic for this. But any of the intermediaries noted, educational institutions, universities, et cetera. I mean, I know the IN2 channel partnership probably a little better if you want me to speak to that, but.
Sure, why don't you start, Neil?
Okay, yeah. So Grid Catalyst participates in two national coalitions. One is the IN2 Innovation Incubator, and that is all of the above to the question. So there are higher ed institutions that have embedded incubator programs, or they're built into a wider innovation ecosystem around research. And they participate in this work, and some of them are driving the change from various ways, as is the University of Minnesota. And we have private, we have government led, we have utility programs like the one we point to with like the Dominion Energy Innovation Center. So it really does come from all kind of parts of the energy ecosystem.
Yeah, I
Next
would just,
question from
oh, go.
Matt. Oh, go ahead, Gabe.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I think that there are some great examples from across the country of some universities who really lean in. My favorite example was Virginia Tech, which actually has their own utility. And they like have student projects and they do integrate a lot of emerging tech within the Virginia Tech utility, which I just think is so cool. And I've been trying to push UMN to start their own utility too. Not really, but I think that'd be fun.
Feel like that is a whole other project. Okay. I'm going to try and get through the last two questions and then we're going to shift to the panel. Although I know we could talk to Gabe for another 2 hours here. So the question for Matt is, if a utility issued an RFP for emerging tech, what foundational elements would you want or expect to see from your perspective? And I can also add a note there.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question. And also, something that I think our utilities in our panel coming up should also take a crack at. But I would say, a clear articulation of scalability. So, like, if successful, then what's the kind of market potential for this technology? I think a sense for like how risk is going to be evaluated and over what time scale. So you don't have this kind of pilotitis of, yeah, we'll do a partnership with a startup, and then if successful, dot dot dot. Right. So like, what's the plan? Like, how do we move from pilot to scale? I think that would be a really important part of these RFPs to say, okay, this is what we're looking for, and here's the path if we're successful. And we've de-risked this technology through the pilot.
Thanks, Gabe. That's really helpful. I think we're going to have to hold the other two questions, although I'll encourage Gabe if you feel like answering them by typing something into the Q&A, you're welcome to. I might also take a look at those and add some information. We're at this tough point where even as we were designing this webinar, we're like, it's really, if we wanted all the perspectives and experts, we'd probably have to do like a 4-part series or some sort of retreat up in the North Woods here, maybe at Jennifer's house in Duluth. So I appreciate that we're kind of moving through some things really quickly, but recognize that we're all here to answer questions, even if it's not in the webinar, but reaching out to us afterward. This is the conversation we're trying to kickstart here in the webinar. So Gabe, my immense gratitude for your partnership and your brilliant brain, and Matt, who couldn't be with us today. And thanks, Becky, for all your hard work on the study as well. We're going to pivot now to our panel, and I'll just say it again. We made this long list of people we would love to hear from regarding this study, and because we weren't willing to do an all-day thing, we had to boil it down. And so to get the perspective from two of the leading utility folks in the state of Minnesota, Ryan, who has an expertise here in Minnesota and from his work nationally, and Sophia, who has done work in Minnesota but is based in Chicago. So we really think this is a wonderful blend of expertise for today's discussion. We're going to kick it over to the panelists to give a quick introduction of themselves and their organizations as Becky gets all our faces in the right places on the screen. So we'll do that and then we'll get into some questions here. And I guess one more thing I will say before we jump to the introduction is just there's so much to talk about within energy innovation. And again, we're going through it really quickly. And so some of these perspectives might be Like how do we bring innovation through to the energy transition? How do we think about affordability? There's just we won't get to everything today, but we'll talk about as much as we can. So I'm just going to go from the top of my screen. Ryan, could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
I can. Hello, everyone. Ryan Fedie. So I spent most of my career working in utilities, currently consulting, working at the intersection between utilities and the startup world. I felt like hearing that recap, Gabe, you gave an overview and short synopsis of what my entire career has felt like working in this space. I've done a lot of work inside utilities, building up both emerging tech and R&D organizations, building up regional and national organizations, working with DOE, working on exactly this topic of how we bridge over the valleys of death that exist and help accelerate new technologies into the marketplace for our energy system.
Thanks, Ryan. Jennifer?
Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Cady. I am the Vice President of Public Policy and External Affairs for ALLETE. ALLETE is a family of energy-centric businesses that includes renewable developers like New Energy Equity and also utilities like Minnesota Power, which is Minnesota's second largest investor-owned utility. We're headquartered in Duluth. You can see behind me, it's a beautiful day. And Nina, we welcome visitors to the Northwoods anytime. MP is very unique amongst our peers in that we serve some of the nation's largest industrial customers on our Iron Range. So taconite mining and paper mills add up to about 3/4 of our energy sales. So we're a very unique utility from that perspective, but so happy to be here with you all and to have this fantastic conversation on innovation. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sophia?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. So I am an original co-founder at Blip Energy. We built a behind-the-meter battery to help with load shifting where it's challenging to permanently install. We can dig more into that later. Prior to that, I did some product development at Tesla. I was a mechanical engineer, so I have a technical background that I brought to the table. And I'm now a product advisor at Blip. And my day job is at the University of Chicago, advising students that are interested in careers in climate and energy.
Thank you, Sophia. That's wonderful. Jeff?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Jeff Haase. I'm the Director of Member Services at Great River Energy. We're a generation and transmission cooperative that serves 26 member owners throughout the state of Minnesota. And we work, at least in my role, we work with those members on all things related to end use activity, demand response, energy efficiency, electrification, economic development, and then ultimately trying to bring those resources into the marketplace. So thinking through that lens of how do we take data to characterize resources and then represent those to the wholesale market and deliver capacity for the benefit of our membership. So really happy to be here and excited about the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay. We are going to start with the startup perspective, maybe because Sophia's a little outnumbered in today's panel. So as a first-time founder, can you share a little bit more about your experience with engaging with utilities? And we'll just start there.
Yeah, I think we were lucky to have great mentorship early on that pushed us to having really early conversations. I think that's where a lot of startups find challenges, especially if they're coming with a technology out of a lab. They want to build the technology and they want the technology to be perfect before they go out and try and sell it. So I think we missed that stumble because we had great mentorship that pushed us to talk to utilities really early. I think one of our challenges is underestimating how diverse utilities can be, both in the customers that they're serving, priorities, mandates from their Public Utility Commission, and all of those things. So I think we talked to a handful of utilities and we said, all right, cool, we've talked to our utilities. And then we dug into let's make this technology perfect. And we did continue to engage throughout the process, different utilities sort of across the country as our market focus shifted. But I think to Gabe's point, it was always really tough to know if you were talking to the right person. It was sometimes tough to get to talk to anyone at all. It did require a lot of warm connections oftentimes to be able to have a conversation. So I'd give us like a 7 or 8 out of 10 on doing the research up front. Yeah. And throughout the process.
Sophia, I'm curious because some of your work came out of a university environment,
Mhm.
correct?
Yeah.
Was some of that mentorship through the university or did it come through another mechanism?
I would say both. Yeah. So some of it was through the sort of innovation program that we went through. Some was early accelerator incubator programs that we went through. Um, yeah, a little bit of both.
Okay, great. I'm going to pivot over to Jeff and Jennifer. And of course, Ryan, anything utility related, you're always welcome to weigh in on. But you both work with utilities that do have a proven track record of innovation. And, it's in the what do we pat ourselves on the back for here in Minnesota, thanks to your work. Can you share more about the systems or processes you have in place to enable innovation? Jeff's already off mute. He's ready to go.
I'll go ahead and start. Yeah, I think one of the benefits that we have at Great River Energy is just the network that we have through our cooperatives, and so thinking about how do we look at the landscape, and we use a number of research partners to do that. We have relationships with the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association as well as the Electric Power Research Institute. And we've done considerable work with Gabe and the University of Minnesota to kind of evaluate really what's coming. And I think that's a constant question that we're thinking about is what's coming next and how do we prepare? Because, it's oftentimes, it's not monolithic. You're not looking for one technology to, invent or identify and bring into the utility picture. It's how do you build upon, the other successes and systems that you've put in place. I think, research as overall is a broad umbrella of activity that is both, discovery internally. I think one of the things that we are very fortunate to have now, and has really changed over the last decade, is the amount of data that we have from advanced metering infrastructure, and that data is helping us to identify new challenges and also, figure out ways of understanding different loads and the way they really interact with the utility system. And so thinking through that lens of here's something we want to try, or here's a particular challenge we want to work through, we have the ability to reach out to those partners and our cooperative members to say, is anyone interested in looking at this? And really, it almost can feel grassroots at times. Hey, we just learned about XYZ new device. Would anyone be interested or have the capacity or want to work through that? And I think there's a lot of things that really happen in that kind of organic way. And in many ways, that's characterized in the report as well. That yes, we have some of those formal relationships with the partners that I mentioned, but also being able to have, side conversations at conferences and then being able to bring that back to our partners and our members and really think through where do we want to try this and how big do we want to make it. Ultimately, scale is necessary to be able to get to those later TRL levels that were identified and discussed by Gabe, but we all have to start somewhere, and often that's a conversation and a willingness to move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's interesting when we think about Sophia's comment about the realization for how different utilities are in their culture and their challenges. And, for GRE, it's like hundreds of cousins, living very different lives with different things that they need. And even for folks that Jennifer's working with in your utility, no community is the same. So even if you're under one more consistent utility umbrella, you're still trying to serve a diversity of needs. But what would you tell us about how you think about innovation?
Thanks, Nina.
Jennifer, I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
I can, but it's breaking up a little bit.
Okay,
Oh,
hang
perfect. Now I
on.
can hear you.
Is
Thank
this
you.
good? Of
Yeah, great.
course that happens,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
Just right
Yeah.
now. It was a real honor, I think, to be asked to participate in this discussion. And so I did a lot of thinking on exactly that question. What does innovation mean to us? And I think I would say at the highest level, we need and seek innovation across multiple aspects of our business. So I think a lot of times we focus on technology innovation, but we also need innovation on process and customer programs and rate design and within our internal team. So I think it's broader than a specific, looking at specific technology, and it's more of trying to embed that into our culture to look for ways to innovate across the business. I love the comment that, no utility is the same. And what maybe might be a little bit different from Jeff's experience is that as a rate regulated utility in the state of Minnesota, we have some really formal processes, planning processes that I think can be gateways to bridging a connection between utilities and startups and bringing ideas forward. So a couple of those I'll highlight is, in Minnesota, we have a very robust integrated resource planning process that involves, public participation and provides a forum for stakeholder conversations. And I think that's really important for utilities that plan on a long-term time horizon to be a part of that early planning process so we can kind of capture those ideas and evaluate how they could fit in the future. We have a similar process for our distribution system through the integrated distribution plan. And then our, bucket of programs focused on energy efficiency, conservation, optimization, eco, that has a similar kind of public process and also a dedicated R&D budget that I think works as a great kind of framework to bring ideas forward. So those might be a little bit a differentiator from Jeff's experience just as a rate regulated utility. And I think confirms what Sophia shared about how every utility might have a different front door or way to kind of get into that process. But I did want to mention broadly that I think innovation can cover many things, and being open to new ideas from technology to implementation to program and delivery is really important.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. It's almost like you could read my mind there because the question I didn't have in mind before, but I think is important, is thinking about this front door, right? It is the most common thing we hear from folks, and that I do genuinely hear from utility folks. We'd love to hear new ideas. We don't like that there. It's not like there is a gate and a moat with intention. It's just not, historically set up that way. And fully being transparent that I worked at a utility, and I know that to be true. To Jeff's example of sometimes it was meeting people at conferences, but almost most commonly was a mentor or an intermediary making the introduction for us. So, is there anything else you'd add about what you'd encourage for startups looking for a front door?
Well, I would almost echo the advice that Sophia started with, that early engagement. I mean, I don't think we can underestimate the power of connection and relationships and conversation. Sometimes that's where the ideas spark, right? Is just bringing an idea forward, but allowing yourself time, because as a rate regulated utility, going through planning processes, going through regulatory approvals can take time, and engaging as early as you can so that we have time to kind of shape the idea together and figure out the implementation details. I think that's the advice that I would give that would set us both utilities and startups up for success.
Yeah. Jeff, anything to add there?
It's great advice early and often communication. I think, understanding the challenge, and having, not that it's a language, but knowing that we're speaking on the same terms, and we're trying to address the same, the challenges that are facing utilities, and yeah, I think to the extent of finding that front door, trying to find those folks that, are engaged on, whatever the technology is. So if it's energy efficiency, demand response, there's a lot of pathways to access the individuals at utilities that are responsible for that, and they're great starting points. But if you're looking at other technologies that are either on the transmission or generation system, focusing that gaze on the right part of the utility is important, and just looking for ways to identify who it is, in terms of, is it through a public forum that you're reaching out and identifying those individuals, or is it through other networking events, perhaps, things like the Energy Innovation Summit that was just recently held at the University of Minnesota. Those are all great avenues to find the individuals that are really focusing on innovation and looking for ways to pilot and identify new technologies.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
We'll keep saying that's where all the cool energy kids are hanging out, or well, maybe we'll like increase the fund participation at the PUC in record numbers in 2026. All right. So just moving us forward, I know we can talk a lot about this topic, but I want to give Ryan a little time here. So you've had a foot in both worlds as a founder yourself, and someone who's worked with the utilities, and because you've been in the West Coast and you've been here, so you really bring a wide perspective into this. What have you seen working either in the West Coast or in Minnesota that you think we should be incorporating more, that we should be replicating more? What really sticks with you of what you've seen that's working?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. Hearing the conversation from Jennifer and Jeff on the utility side, it really strikes true to me that I just want to double tap on is, just having those conversations with the utilities, and then also knowing, the utilities have a deep pool of vendors that they utilize today and partners in the industry, and just knowing what side of the organization you're going into. As Jeff alluded to, customer innovation looks very different than transmission or distribution or generation. So just knowing going into what part of the organization you're trying to sell to or bring the innovation into is really helpful for startups and the ecosystem trying to engage better with utilities. On the other side, Sophia started with, well, we don't know if we're a solution looking for a problem or if the utility really needs this or not. Right. And there it's really important, and it was highlighted in the report, that the utilities that are out there are actually taking the time to understand their innovation agenda, are doing a real help not only internally to the organization, so you understand what your internal challenges are and what you're trying to solve for, but then you let it out into the world and get the ecosystem that's out there know if they're a good match or not for bringing that product to the utility. So that's something that's not done as often, that I think utility can do better, is spending a lot of time first understanding what are our challenges, what gaps do we have in our business that we need to solve, and then making those challenges broadly known, which I know can be hard to do in a heavily regulated utility, or in an industry that's not used to going out and sharing everything. But knowing what are those innovation gaps that you're trying to close, so the industry can partner with you in helping close the gaps.
Yeah, that's really great, Ryan.
Yeah.
Any specific examples that you could note that you've seen? I know you and I have talked a little bit about programmatically where things have been able to get traction that just help us kind of dial into the tangible side of it.
Yeah, and on the tangible side, certainly we could pick out a technology to dive deep into, and we've talked a lot about different technologies and how we've solved kind of maturing and accelerating the adoption of different technologies. Obviously, in the consumer space, you have a lot more partnerships you can work with a little more out in the open with the commercial product space. But I think what's more important and we don't talk about as much is the ecosystem side. So really exciting to see this report focus on the ecosystem, as outlasting any single technology is helping bring that culture to the industry, and the ecosystem and the institutional support needed to last through time. Because we know we'll have funding cycles, technology cycles that go up and down. But a lot of the work we started on the West Coast about 15 years ago was really building the institutional and cultural underpinnings that would help go through different cycles and roller coasters that we went through. So it's building the knowledge of product development. It was building the portfolio management knowledge, building the ecosystem understanding of the partnership networks that exist, how utilities can work with each other, and how they can start to build that institutional knowledge that can start to do this in a repetitive and consistent basis over time. So with specific examples, we built up emerging technology advisory committees, both inside the utilities, at the regional level, and then West Coast level, bringing in the investor-owned utilities from California and the CEC in particular to coordinate our activities. And I think then also bridging across the US, we worked with EPRI, DOE, the national labs. And one of the key pieces there was just having the conversation around what do we even mean by emerging technology? You know, it's getting the language right so we understand the language and the different places on the adoption curve so we can start to have better coordination. Because everyone up front, when you say collaborate, they say we love to collaborate, right? People are really open to collaborating, but then you have to get down below that under the surface and say, what does that mean to collaborate? How do we actually effectively coordinate these efforts to move the industry forward? And that's where the real work happens in the product development space and the innovation space.
Yeah, that's great, Ryan. Thank you. It's always so interesting because we are sort of a close-knit community here in Minnesota. And not to say there's not tremendous more work to do and we say collaboration a lot, we say partnership a lot, and I think it is there. And sometimes we can take it for granted around how intentional we have to be to get to the outcome we're looking for. And recognizing that if you're a utility and you're making sure that the power is on and the hospitals have what they need and the life, health, safety, and affordability things that can make it like just where you have to hyper focus. Or if you're a startup and you're trying to make sure you can make payroll for everybody and that you're meeting a milestone for like everybody has their thing that they can just get sucked into because it's around the survival or important, like most critical aspect that the first thing we tend to lose is that intentional, like what are we doing together? So it's such a good reminder of it. I am going to turn a little bit into policy and regulatory, which Ryan, you were getting us down that road a little bit. I'm curious can be for anyone to share examples of any policy or regulatory actions that you think, Jennifer, you noted eco earlier, and some of the R&D capabilities. So anything in particular you've said, this has really unlocked something for us, or we're on the way to unlocking something because this thing has changed. Is there anything you want to highlight there?
Yeah, Nina, I'll start. And I think in Minnesota, our ECO, which is energy conservation and optimization programs, have been a really successful example of how policy can drive a market. So a couple of things that I think have made that successful over the years is a very clear goal, right? Which was to reduce a percentage of retail electric sales each year. And then, the state kind of set up a very defined approach to that in terms of how we're going to measure it, what programs we're going to kind of authorize, and then setting aside a specific portion of that budget for research and development. I think that policy also did a nice job crafting evaluation metrics. So, when you bring something through that program, it has to pass a cost benefit analysis on a number of different things, financial, societal, et cetera. And so I think that framework has been really successful. I think all of the utilities in Minnesota have done a great job on energy conservation and energy efficiency. And that framework has not only helped kind of guide the utility, but also provide kind of a prescribed framework for others to opt in, right? So if you are a vendor in that space, you know that a budget will be set every year, that there's a specific amount of dollars for R&D, and there's kind of a way to engage there. So I think that that framework and pathway that Minnesota has set up around energy efficiency is a really fantastic example of how policy can help open doors, make it a little bit easier for startups, utilities, vendors to connect with each other, and then provide some clear alignment. Because I do think in this era of so much going on, so much change broadly, that being aligned in what we're trying to achieve is really critical to success.
Great, Jennifer. Anybody else want to note anything on the policy regulatory front? Jeff, go ahead.
I'll just add a little bit of our own experience to that as well. I think, the changes that took place as a result of ECO, the transition from, the Conservation Improvement Program to the Energy Conservation and Optimization Program was really one that was, has its objectives in, understanding that there's so much to this. There's a more holistic approach. And as we're seeing more electric technologies showing that cost effectiveness, to end users, which hadn't always been the case. And as we're looking at how do you, optimize, how do you take, say, an air source heat pump and provide a mechanism for controlling that or providing some load flexibility with that heat pump or even with electric vehicles. These are all, they're not new technologies, but the market adoption of those two technologies in particular is relatively recent. And I think when we look at how do you integrate those into the system and employ different types of control technologies or technology visibility and have the ability to get data, there's a lot we can do. And we've worked with NRECA and OEMs across the country to, really, and Minnesota Power was included in this research as well, to really identify what is the, demand response capability and how do we utilize, kind of low voltage connections to control those technologies, because they are advanced and they don't really work on an on-off switch as well as our past technologies have worked. And I think when we look forward to how do you not only think about integrating, light duty EVs, but also looking forward to medium and heavy duty EVs, there's a lot of planning and education that needs to be part of that discussion because it takes a while to connect some of those systems and the control technologies or the visibility that you have into the operations is different. And that's some of the work that we're doing right now that isn't necessarily informed by startups, but are informed more by some of our research partners through the likes of EPRI and even our own membership.
Thanks, Jeff. Ryan or Sophia, anything you want to weigh in on there, or should we pivot to the next topic? Go ahead.
I'll just add that I know that the work on the innovation regulatory sandboxes, I think, is really important. We're at a time where we're seeing a lot more, not just policy changes, but technology and business model changes, where it's going to be important to be able to give the space for the industry to figure things out on all sides. And it needs some evolution as well. So I really applaud the work that's being done there. I know there can be a lot of discussion in the industry on the shareholder incentives around kind of innovation and are there barriers to kind of some of the regulatory model for driving innovation. I'll just say in my experience working with all types of utilities that it's more of a shared lack of structure around innovation in our industry. Gabe had the report on the percent spent on formal R&D in the utility industry. It's really low. At Bonneville Power on formal R&D, we started at 0.25% of revenue, moved up to half, and we're on the way to shade under 0.75% of revenue, which is high for the industry, but terribly low compared to any other industry. So I think, there's a lot of work to bringing that culture to the industry. And in many ways, there's good reason for it. We know that in our industry, we're an 8760 3 nines reliability that we have to provide. And if we change something, it might be once every 20 years. And if it goes wrong, I've seen individuals who carry that weight through their whole career and will say, you know, we came close to being an hour from possibly close to the edge of the grid. We weren't quite sure. We'll never get there again in my career, kind of response, right? And that is because we take tremendous responsibility to ensuring the lights always stay on. So there's good reason for that. But building into the organization the ability to try new things, do it in a safe way and environment, whether using digital twins. We know we're not going to go straight into the dispatch room and change out their whole screen. That's just not going to work, right? But where do we have digital twins? Where do we have lab resources we can go into and test different things? Where we can start to do incremental change, where it doesn't have to be radical change. We can incrementally change things over time, and then we have to reward it. At Bonneville Power, that took a lot of time and courage to say, you know, we tried something, it didn't work, but we celebrated it. And we gave awards for failing. We gave awards for testing something just to see if it would work. You know, we gave awards for killing projects. So these projects don't have to be zombies that live on for 10 years, right? If you test it, fail quick, fail fast, in a year or two, if it's not working on a 5-year project, we're going to cut it. Or even 6 months into a project. Reformulate it doesn't mean you can't ever come back again, right? But let's understand what went wrong and learn from it and come back again. So building that culture of learning, failing fast, modifying and coming back again, I think can be difficult, especially in a regulatory environment where you might not want to come back every few months with a different approach in a rate case, as an example. But we really need to help you to move the industry along to be able to move quickly and shift and modify over time altogether and have it be okay if things don't go right. But make sure that we learn from it and all move forward together.
Yeah, oh my gosh, so much I wanted to unpack with that, Ryan. If we had more time, can I ask you to do something just for folks who maybe don't understand what 4 nines means? Could you explain where that sits in the reliability threshold?
Yeah, I think the technical term is it will always, always, always be there.
That's the best technical explanation ever. I will note when I think about this from my old utility world, someone at some point, I don't know if it was because the spreadsheet didn't have the right, how many behind the dot, how many behind the decimal spots, or someone just decided I'd just round down or up, and there was a very great conversation from the head of operations about why the 4 nines just can't be messed with. So maybe a homework assignment for some of the folks learning about why reliability is so top tier for thinking about operations and how to de-risk that, right? And so this is actually, I'm going to turn to Sophia for a little series here, but start with, so Sophia, we're hearing a lot from the folks who are the adopters. And we're giving you the mic here. What do you want? Not maybe necessarily these 3 folks, but the utilities and the intermediaries to know about your perspective, your experience in that. What do you wish they knew about what startups are trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think a big challenge for startups is that we are by definition building the plane as we fall out of the sky. So we're building the technology while we find a market for it. And like all of those pieces have to fit in order to get to the next piece. And one thing that can be tricky, we talked a lot today about the immense responsibility towards reliability and how that can be a detractor from the urge to innovate, right? Because new things are more unknown. One way I think that a lot of startups can get around that is by piloting privately, right? You have a product that you may want to ultimately work with utilities on, but you're going to do a private pilot with some commercial partners, or you're going to do a private pilot with residential customers. The challenge there on the startup side that I just want to bring to light is that it's a great way to get around sort of the reliability challenges and I'll call it risk aversion. I think we can maybe all agree that that's an appropriate term. But then on our side, we're catching criticism from investors for not being focused. They're saying, well, why are you bothering with residential? You want to sell to utilities, like you're getting off the path. This is inefficient. So it's just something that we're navigating all the time, is how to prove that the technology works so that we can meet the milestones that utilities need to see in order to do a pilot with us or deploy our technology. But on the back end, we're like catching additional slack for going off the beaten path to do a pilot with someone who's not necessarily going to be our end customer. And it's something you explain away, and it's just part of the situation. But I think one thing that would really help is if utilities can be involved, if they can be an observer of a pilot that might not be directly with the utility, right? It might be a commercial or industrial pilot that's demonstrating the technology. But if there's a way to be involved, to commit to reviewing the data, to do check-ins, to whatever it is, so that you're a part of the story. Because as much as we want to get the technology across the finish line, we can't do that if we don't have a story that'll allow us to raise additional funding and apply to grants and whatever else. So that's maybe just like pulling back the curtain a little bit on one of the challenges with getting past TRL 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, so much there, Sophia. One thing I'll definitely note is we've invited utility partners to come into our pilots that are behind the meter pilots on a few different projects to encourage that learning. And I
Yeah.
will say one thing we unexpectedly hit was this a little bit of, I'll just say fear for lack of a better word right now, of a gotcha. Like that there would be another thing that we were obligating them to versus it just really being the best thing you can offer right now is your insight and your expertise into what this startup is trying to learn and how they need to get better and how they meet your expectations. And we really do try and have those conversations around, we need 2 hours of your time over 3 months. And in this conversation and being really clear about those expectations and then trying to stay within them so we can build trust for the next time that we come with that request. And, to several points been made here, like those are great places to start to build that relationship. Ideally, it's started before them, but if not, that's a great place to come in. So, that'll carry me over here to the question about thinking of where we work, right, is in this proof of concept technology phase, as we discussed. We do have these technological readiness levels as a measure of progress, and we talked quite a bit about that. And where things are ready to be field tested still has some nuance, but there's still a gap here in this cycle. So, in an example, I met with a company a couple weeks ago who has a really interesting product. And to your point, Sophia, they're going to test it at a hospital because there's some functionality there that they can be working with. This utility had applied, or sorry, this startup had applied to our program, but they weren't far enough along from a TRL level when they applied. So now they actually have this roadmap where they're coming in, they're working with the hospital. But I asked the question, have you talked to the utility that serves the hospital? And they had not, right? So here's this like easy point to get. Otherwise, you're just, again, you're starting from scratch, really mature into your process. So that's one way, certainly, that we can look at those types of things, but we probably need more tangible things around de-risked pilots or other proof points. So I'm just curious where other folks see opportunities to close this gap, recognizing we've already talked about some other things around big innovation, but really talking about this pilot. And I'll open up to all four of you to weigh in of where you see kind of the most immediate opportunities.
I just emphasize Ryan's point earlier about how important a sandbox is to this concept. And, I don't think we can, it's been said on this panel, I don't think we can say enough how serious the utilities obligation is to reliability and grid security and even affordability. But if we can create a safe place to do everything that Ryan said, like fail fast, limit risk, let's not break the grid unintentionally. That's always the number one goal. But I think setting up that sandbox framework where, we're minimizing the risk, we're able to identify quickly if there's an opportunity or not, and then move on. I really do think that's the key to kind of moving forward quickly and identifying opportunities and minimizing risk at the same time. So maybe I stole Ryan's answer, but I agree with him that's a really important foundation.
I think a +1, Jennifer, just tells us we're on the right track with an idea. So I think that's a good thing. That's a good validation. Jeff, what do you have to share?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I agree, with everything Jennifer said and Ryan, about, wanting to have those areas where it is not imparting a lot of risk, either to the participant, the end user, or the utility, but also understand that there is a lot of data that the utilities can bring, to the table as we're thinking about that, and that I think that is a really powerful element, and just further validates the need to engage quickly on the front end, so that that AMI data that is available for that member or that customer is readily accessible and can be used to validate the results and illustrate what that technology is doing. And that's really where our when we think about, like, where's the single source of truth in all of this? How do you evaluate whether or not something is working, whether or not it's failing? Is it accomplishing the right objectives? It's always going to come through in the data, one way or the other, and it's not going to, tell a rosy picture, or it's just going to be what it is. And the sooner that we can get to, data that can be used for, as evidence of the technology's effectiveness, or the software's effectiveness, or the approach's effectiveness, I think the more that we'll be able to kind of carry those results forward. And I think the other thing to remember is that, and it's one of the reasons why we do work so much with our industry partners in NRECA and EPRI, and I know EESI is a similar trade organization for the investor-owned utilities, is that that's the network. If once the technology is identified that is the quote unquote killer app for any particular situation, then there's a ready lineup of utilities that are eager to be second. Yeah, and that's the thing that's always that is interwoven within this discussion around reliability and risk aversion, is it's really those that are trying to be the first and implement that serial number one device. There is a risk that's happening, but if it works, word gets out pretty quick. And I think you start seeing that, kind of the viral moment that'll happen after that. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, just doubling down. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Sophia.
I was gonna say, doubling down on the need for a sandbox. I think that's what everyone wants. Like, if what we need in order to do a pilot is an isolated microgrid, like, I'm happy to put my technology there. Let's get it there. Let's test it. Firefighters have burn houses, right? Like, they have those crazy concrete buildings that they light on fire and they go in and put it all out. Not that we should talk about fire on a panel about utilities, but having a sandbox where we can test things without, figuratively speaking, lighting the house on fire, is so helpful. And I think something that everyone wants. It's just complicated and expensive. And when utilities are, again, tasked with producing and delivering energy in the most cost-effective way for their constituents, running a test house is expensive. So I don't know whose sandbox it needs to be. But I do think that that's a huge way to close the gap, is just having a place where we can test technologies that everyone feels happy about around the table.
Yeah. Thanks, Sophia. I want to make sure I distinguish for folks that there are two types of things at play here. One is a regulatory sandbox, where we're thinking about what are the test parameters outside of a traditional docket. that allow you to advance ideas that still meet the core things around affordability, reliability, et cetera, but can fast track things. And and
Mhm.
I think we need test beds. And shout out to the folks who have stepped up and done things in a test bed matter, and like our friends at the Center for Microgrid Research at the University of St. Thomas,
Yep.
that's one of their core purposes. Our friends at some of the University of Minnesota lab spaces, the national labs, et cetera, but some dedicated spaces that feel accessible. I know that that's a really important component of things. As expected, we're going to run out of time with so many things left to talk about. We've got about 13 minutes left. I just want to give the panel a chance to say anything else that you really hope to share today, because we just didn't have enough time that you really want the audience to come away with. Otherwise, we'll pivot to the Q&A. And Ryan, I'd like to start with you if you have any closing thoughts, or if you want to come back to +1 the regulatory sandbox one more time, the mic is yours.
I would say just two things. One, let's assume we get that all right. We've done the collaborative innovation together in sandboxes. We're not replicating and piloting people to death. We're jointly relying on others' results in those sandboxes that we can then take back and adopt. That's really only the beginning of the journey. There's still a lot of work to take that new technology and figure out how to implement it within the utility space into the mainstream of the business lines, and then scale it and do that scaling. So, getting to that point is kind of the start of the journey, especially for startups, if you're going to be scaling along with your partner at the utility. But inside the utility, there's a lot of work to understand, okay, we got it out of emerging tech. How do we get it into the business line? How do we adopt it to our mainstream practices and start to scale it as day to day, which is a whole nother webinar, but there's a lot of work there as well. And then kind of going full circle, if you look at the industry, in creating, EPRI was mentioned before. It's seen as one of the industry groups we all rely on in the electric industry as kind of the national organization for R&D. That's a good chunk of our spend goes to that industry collaborative. I've had the chance to work with EPRI throughout the years, read some of the originating documents when EPRI was formed back in the late 60s and in early 70s. And if you read it, I think it gives you clues to how we approach innovation in the industry. So some of those formative documents really focused around nuclear generation at the time, and the anchors who were building out the nuclear fleet or operating the nuclear fleet across the country. And a lot of it was done almost defensively, that they were getting pressure from outside and at the national level that if not the industry starts to do R&D in these spaces, we might have to create this thing called the Department of Energy to do some national research around energy. And the industry didn't fend it off forever. We eventually created the Department of Energy. But I just think it shows there, are embedded reasons and cultural reasons why innovation is tough in this industry. Not that the industry doesn't want to do it, but it really, with that reliability imperative and needing to scale and be assured of the changes that the industry takes, that it does take a while, but it certainly is worth it. And I think we need the startup ecosystem working with us. And that just takes a lot of conversation for how we can work together better, and at what phase and what time it makes sense to partner deeply and take each other's time to move the technology forward.
Great insights, Ryan. I'm
Yep.
so glad you brought that context forward, and also so glad you're in Minnesota now. Now we just got to convince Sophia to leave Chicago, and I'll have all 4 of these smart minds here. Anybody else want to offer any parting thoughts before we try and tackle a couple Q&A questions?
Nina, I wouldn't mind offering a concluding thought here, and that is that, as a regulated utility in the state of Minnesota, we have to comply with the state's carbon-free standard by 2040. And utility planning horizons are long. It takes time to work through regulatory approval processes and permitting processes, and then physically build things. And so I think the more aligned that innovators can be with the industry on what we're trying to achieve and how to really maximize the value of each investment, will be really critical in these next 15 years. Because from my perspective, 2040 feels like it's tomorrow in utility land. And so really being kind of laser focused on what our priorities are to decarbonize the grid reliably and affordably and maintain safety, fail fast, like get those ideas out early and work them as we can. I just wanted to share, I think urgency was the word in the report. And I really feel that from the utility perspective. And so the more aligned we can be on the end goal that we're all trying to achieve together, the better.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I think I'll certainly be taking away from this conversation something that we've already been talking about in the background is like, what does that roundtable look like? That's not performative, that is really like, hey, y'all, let's get in a room and figure out how to do some really cool things together. And I think it is, more sophisticated in the way you said it, but that there's this purpose that I really think if you got people together that you could we could do some tangible things towards those goals. So Jeff or Sophia?
Yeah, building off of what Jennifer was saying, I think one thing that would be immensely helpful on the startup front as well, back to sort of the need to tell a story, the need to live another day in order to get to the trajectory Ryan was talking about of being able to scale and get to the next step. Is even just more of a conversation. I think we talked at the very top about how every utility is so unique and has a really unique set of needs. I think there's absolutely a responsibility on the startup side to understand the needs of the partner that you're talking to. Don't sell residential solutions to primarily commercial entities, et cetera. From the utility side, it would be super helpful to have a help telling the story, help us envision what scale looks like. This something like, oh yeah, this is a great solution for us, and here's 6 other utilities that are shaped like us that could use this solution, versus having a great conversation with one utility partner and then all of a sudden the startup's going back to the drawing board trying to find through the grapevine which other types of utilities could use that type of solution, or it would be compelling to speak with. So I so value the partnerships that we've had with utilities throughout the journey. I think it's easy to get focused on like, how do we make this partnership work, and lose sight of like, how do we make this partnership work and what does scale actually look like, so that we can tell the scale story, so that we can go raise funding to actually scale that solution and be impactful and valuable to the utilities that are taking time and money out of their day to support us in that journey.
Thanks, Sophia. Jeff, you might be closing us out here at this point.
Well, yeah, I'll keep it brief, Nina. Thank you. I just as we close out the year, 2026 is upon us now. It's a reminder of how quick time goes, and one of the things I'm reminded of is we're often looking at 5-year horizons. Jennifer alluded to the fact that we're on a 15-year planning horizon, and so that 10 years is going to happen very quickly. And I'm reflecting now because we've just closed out some initiatives internally at GRE around our grid modernization efforts, which involved a whole host of activities that were spearheaded in 2015 around AMI, demand response management systems, telecommunications, and meter data sharing among our members. And what I'm struck by is how those changes and how that effort internally, which did involve a lot of our own internal, self-reflection and research, is building on everything else that comes after it. And so these become the platforms upon which we're able to execute our next steps and make it easier. And I think that's a transition that's happening across the industry, or has happened in many parts of the industry, that I think is going to make it potentially easier to create these sandbox environments that we're talking about. How do you do it as quickly as possible? How do you assess and pivot as quickly as possible? Those are the things we need to be doing. Because 2040 is going to be upon us in a blink of an eye, seemingly, and the change is happening. We often feel like change is happening to us, but change is also happening internally at every utility. We're revising the way we're doing business. We're trying, we're becoming leaner, we're becoming more efficient, and we're applying all of these technologies in new ways. And that's the thing that I'm hopeful for is that change is all positive in a lot of shared directions, and we have the ability to do more now than we've ever had, and it's an exciting time, and one that I think is going to enable us to work more collaboratively and productively with smaller parties and startups.
Thanks, Jeff. This is where it's not as fun to be in the webinar because a round of applause from just me is going to be far less impressive than all the folks who've been listening in. But just so deeply grateful for all of you for the work you do always, but for bringing that insight into today's conversation. Uh, I don't know that I've ever wrapped up a webinar and wanted to go back that I was part of, and I want to go back and listen to really take a second beat with some of the things that you all said. So I'm glad that we recorded and we'll share this out. But for me, some of these really big takeaways around early communication and partnership and collaboration, working together to fix these places of how do we de-risk, how do we prove things out, how do we make sure that we're aligning what the need is with what's possible with the innovation. It makes it feel like we can get over this commercialization value of death. It makes it feel like we can put all the connective tissue together to get to that future energy system that we all are working toward. And in December of 2025, a little hope feels really good right now, and a lot of partnership and collaboration feels really good right now. So I hope that that's what folks are taking out of this. I know we didn't get to some questions in the chat, or in the Q&A, and I want to recognize that. And we'll try and put some questions back, answer some of those via email when we send out the result. But if we can capture this energy, intention, connection to do real things together next year, I'm gonna feel really good about that, as you can tell. Like it just really is what's possible. And it's why we started Grid Catalyst. It is absolutely why we're here. I hope that we get to be part of building this with you all, and not just our panelists and not just Gabe and Becky, but all the folks who are going to end up listening to this webinar. Um, so thank you. Leaving with a lot of gratitude, a lot to think about, and a lot to do. So thank you, everyone. We're going to close this out. Becky, let me know if I need to do anything else to capture our Q&A. But thank you, everyone, so much, and follow-ups coming soon. And a little round of applause as we close. Thank you.